The forest was quiet that morning. Mist drifted low across the underbrush, clinging to the base of towering pine trunks like breath still not exhaled. Somewhere in the canopy, a single thrush called twice, then fell silent. The usual rustle of squirrels, the hum of early insects, gone. Stillness pressed against the edges of the woodland like a held note. At the border of this ancient stillness, where trees gave way to low ferns and fractured sunlight, a wild boar was digging. He was large, thick-necked, shoulders broad from a life spent pushing through thickets and root webs. His hide was mottled with old scars and fresh mud, his tusks chipped but strong. Each thrust of his snout sent tufts of wet soil flying. Worms twisted briefly in the air before vanishing back underground. Pebbles rolled free, some clicking together in odd rhythms. To an observer, there would be nothing unusual in this. Boars dig. But this one returned to the same spot every morning. Not a wallow, not a foraging patch. Just a shallow depression in the earth, marked only by bent grass and disturbed moss. He never stayed long, maybe 10 minutes. He dug, snorted, stood still as if listening, then wandered off. Today, however, something changed. As his tusks struck deeper, the resistance shifted. The familiar soft loam gave way to something denser, compacted, heavy, clay perhaps. He braced his front legs and bore down. The soil cracked slightly beneath him, and below, meters beneath the roots, the fossils, the untouched layers of stone, the weight of the continent shifted, just slightly, less than a breath's width. The change went unnoticed by the animal. He only paused, blinked, and turned his head sideways as if hearing something faint and unfamiliar. Then he resumed digging. A root snapped. Moisture hissed upward like the earth exhaling. Far away inside a ranger station tucked beneath the ridge, a monitoring screen blinked once. An anomaly logged at 3:42 a.m. Not enough to alert anyone. Just noise. Just one more number in a data set. And still the boar dug, unaware that the place he stood had been quiet not just for years, but for centuries. And that, by the end of the week, this patch of soil would be marked on satellite maps in red. But for now, it was just forest, and the sound of tusks tearing into earth. It was 3:42 a.m. when the sensor pinged. A flicker, a whisper of movement so small it barely escaped the system's built-in tolerance range. The digital seismograph registered a microshift, 0.7 on the local scale, lasting less than 4 seconds. In the control room of the South Ridge Ecological Station, a green light blinked twice, then returned to steady. No alarm, no message, just a silent note, filed into the system's memory among thousands of others. But beneath the forest, the earth had moved. Not much, not enough to crack surface rock, but enough for the pressure to redistribute, like an ancient exhale between stone lungs. Deep in the crust, a fault line long thought dormant flexed subtly. Tension slid from one layer to another, the shift traveling slowly like a snake beneath a blanket. At the surface, nothing was out of place. Birds had begun calling again in the early light. A squirrel scampered across a fallen log. Rain from the previous night glistened on every leaf. From above, the forest looked as serene as ever, untouched, timeless. But the animals felt it. The deer that normally grazed at the lower ridgeline never emerged. The foxes didn't cross the usual paths that morning. Even the crows, bold and loud, changed their roost. It wasn't panic. It was something quieter. A biological calculation older than language. The forest had shifted slightly. That was enough. Back at the ranger station, no one reviewed the tremor log. A larger storm had washed out a bridge farther west, and attention had turned to logistics, not soil data. The only being who returned to the anomaly site that morning was the boar. He approached the disturbed patch slowly. The moss was darker, wetter than usual. He sniffed once, pawed at the edge of the crater he'd made. No fresh insects, no fungus. Still, he dug. But this time, only once. One jab of the snout. Then he paused, backed away, and did something he hadn't done all week. He stood still for a full minute, eyes scanning the trees, breath slow, and then he turned away. Not fleeing, just done. The ground beneath where he had stood no longer felt right. The trees creaked gently in the wind, and meters below, the fractured line of ancient stone began to carry that tension just a little farther. It began with silence where sound should have been. The chorus of insects that usually rose by mid-morning never started. A grove that echoed daily with woodpecker strikes and squirrel chatter now felt like the inside of a closed room. A heron flew in low over the tree line, dipped toward the shallow stream and, without touching down, rose again, its wide wings beating fast as it veered toward higher ground. At first, the absence of normal rhythms wasn't noticed. Rangers were focused on repairing flood-damaged trails, and no one tracked bird migration this early in the season. But the animals did. The red deer that roamed the southern basin stopped traveling their usual trail, rerouting through deeper brush farther from the old grove. Foxes moved erratically, darting out during daylight hours, scavenging far from dens. A cluster of owls, usually fiercely territorial, abandoned a known nesting hollow overnight. No fights, no blood. Just gone. One ranger, Mira, noted it in her logbook. Unusual void at Site 6. Tracks suggest complete absence of larger fauna. We'll monitor. She wrote it more out of instinct than concern, the way you might note a strange smell in your house and promise to check the fridge later. Deep underground, the sensors continued to record minute shifts in pressure, tiny changes in gas seepage, micro cracks registering as vertical noise on the readout. Nothing clear enough to interpret, but persistent enough to draw a slow line across the week's data. The program flagged it as a possible mineral subsidence, an automated guess. Still no alerts. But the pattern was growing. The same fox that had moved its den 3 days earlier was now circling in wide loops, far from its usual grounds, restless. A flock of finches abandoned a fruiting tree mid-season, and each morning, the boar did not return. Not once. As if the thing that had drawn him had already finished what it came to do. Still, the soil where he had dug remained soft, almost warm in places. Mira noticed this on day 4. Kneeling beside the old digging site, she pressed her palm into the earth and felt it, barely perceptible, but wrong. Like something beneath the surface was breathing. She took a soil sample, bagged it, and walked back to the truck in silence. No radio calls, no conclusions. But later that night, she opened the logbook again and underlined a single word: pattern. The laboratory results from the soil sample came back in 3 days. The composition was mostly ordinary: loam, decayed organic matter, standard mineral content. But there were anomalies. Gas pockets, incredibly small, laced just below root depth. Not methane, not radon. Something inert, something old, something misplaced. The geologist who reviewed the scan hesitated before noting, possibly trapped emissions from previously stable rock compression. It was the sort of phrase that gets filed, not flagged. But Mira kept reading. Moisture readings in the sample were inconsistent. Water saturation changed dramatically over a depth of just 8 centimeters. That meant movement, fluid redistribution, pressure. She stared at the chart for a long time, feeling the weight of intuition. When nothing is clearly wrong, but nothing is right either. Back at Site 6, things felt heavier. Not in the metaphorical sense, literally heavier. Her boots sank deeper. The ground, though dry above, gave too easily. When she crouched, she heard a low groan, far below. Not a sound exactly, more like the feeling of wood bending inside a wall. That same morning, a satellite pass over the area registered a 12-meter depression in the canopy contour, small enough to ignore, but new. The shift wasn't visible from ground level. Trees still stood, but roots were gripping something no longer steady. Deep beneath the forest, down past the silt and sand, a cracked ribbon of bedrock continued to pull. It wasn't fast, it wasn't loud, but it was constant. Every hour the tension spread, curling toward a deeper vein of sediment, long pressed into place by weight and time. A structure meant to stay locked forever, until now. And above it the trees stood still. The wind passed untroubled, and Mira, alone in the stillness, wrote one sentence in her next report. The ground has begun to breathe. No one responded. It began with a low vibration, nothing dramatic, just a subtle tremor that hummed beneath the forest floor like a tuning fork struck somewhere deep within the earth. Birds rose abruptly from trees without calling. Leaves shifted though there was no wind. Mira felt it through the soles of her boots, a slow pulse that grew stronger the longer she stood. She turned slowly in place, scanning the ferns, the trees, the light cutting through pine trunks. Everything looked still, but it wasn't. The moss on the rocks had started to sag. A nearby patch of earth caved in by just a centimeter. Then another. A ripple of motion, barely visible, crawled across the forest floor like a breath moving under a blanket. Mira backed away. Her radio crackled, but no voice followed. The silence swallowed it whole. She raised her camera to document the shifting soil, but before she could snap the frame, the ground let go. Not fully, just a sudden sinking, a gasp from the earth. A hole no wider than a foot cracked open near the old Boar's digging site. Cold air pushed up from it with unnatural force. It didn't smell like rot or gas. It smelled sterile, ancient, like air sealed away before language existed. The trees nearby groaned softly as their roots began to shift, losing grip. Mira dropped to one knee instinctively, trying to find stability, but the terrain no longer behaved like solid land. It flexed slightly beneath her. She stumbled back, whispering, "No, no, no," under her breath, half to the forest, half to herself. Deep below, the fault line made its first audible sound, a muted, grinding groan like rocks scraping over wet bone. Somewhere in the valley, a fox let out a sharp, broken yelp, and then fell silent. The breach had begun. Not a collapse. Not yet. But something deep had unlatched. A slow-motion failure of Earth's memory. And no one else had seen it. Only her, the animals, and whatever moved in the darkness far beneath the trees. The following day, clouds hung low over the forest like a ceiling sagging from age. A strange warmth clung to the undergrowth, humid and unseasonal. Insects had not returned. The trees, once whispering with movement, now stood perfectly still, as if holding their breath. Mira sat alone in the station's monitoring room, reviewing seismic logs from the past 48 hours. The patterns were no longer subtle. Small tremors had begun clustering, their frequency rising. Still minor in magnitude, but too consistent, too local. She zoomed in. The epicenters were circling a single point. Site 6, the old digging spot. The same place where the boar had returned and then vanished. Where the hole had appeared. Where she had felt the ground move beneath her like a sleeping animal shifting in a dream. Mira leaned forward and manually overrode the automated thresholds. The screen lit up in yellow, then orange. At that same moment, a deep rumble passed through the station's foundation. So low it vibrated the metal in the walls, setting a pen rolling off her desk. It lasted 7 seconds. Enough to make the hanging lights sway gently. Enough to make Mira rise, grab her field pack, and run. Out in the forest, the changes were now visible. Trees tilted slightly off axis. Small fractures had opened in the soil, thin and dark, like surgical cuts. Water that once pooled in shallow depressions now disappeared entirely, sucked down through hairline cracks that hadn't been there the week before. The animals had vanished. Not even crows circled. No prints, no movement, no sound. It was as if the entire ecosystem had lifted its body and shifted sideways. Mira reached Site 6 just after noon. The light was harsh, but the forest beneath the canopy remained dim. The air smelled metallic, as though something below had bled. The hole had widened. It was now over a meter across, and just visible inside. Twisting root systems dangled down into blackness that shimmered with damp air. She dropped a glow stick in. It took 4 seconds before the faint tick of impact echoed back. That meant depth, serious depth. Her radio cracked to life with partial signal. System update, Minor faulting, stay alert. But the message broke apart again into static. She reached into her vest, pulled out a red plastic tag, field risk level, and snapped it from green to orange. Officially, this marked the site as unstable terrain. But she knew that wasn't enough. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't groundwater saturation. Something beneath the forest was detaching. From the ridge above, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and Mira heard the echoing creak of old wood shifting. But not from the trees. From underground, the sound rolled through the trunks like thunder trapped in a wooden drum. A nearby rock cracked. She backed away. Then she froze. Movement. The ground not far from her boots had started to rise. Just slightly, like a ripple building under stretched skin. It pulsed once, then again. Something beneath was straining upward. Something that had shifted too far and was trying to correct. The ground had become a fabric stretched over pressure that no longer wanted to be ignored. Mira stared down at the spot, barely breathing, then took 3 slow steps back. The ground did not move again. But it would. Not today. Not maybe even tomorrow. But soon. And when it did, it wouldn't be a tremor. It would be a release. It began at 4:12 a.m. The forest was black, silent, and wet with dew when the first sound broke the stillness. Not a roar, not a crash, but a deep, bone-dull snap, like the earth itself had flexed a tendon. No one was there to hear it. Mir had stayed up late reviewing her data, but exhaustion overtook her just before dawn. She slept with her boots on, radio beside her, windows open to the cold air. The vibration arrived 4 minutes later. This time, it wasn't gentle. The seismograph needle jumped hard, then jittered, then steadied, only to spike violently upward in a tight, chaotic wave. Readings poured into the server like a machine choking on its own urgency. Magnitude, 4.1. Then, 4.8. Then, in a final breathless surge, 5.3. Not enough to topple cities, but enough to change everything underground. At Site 6, the surface gave way in a series of slow-motion collapses, each deeper than the last. The hole widened from 1 meter to 10 in less than 2 minutes. Ancient roots were torn out like veins pulled from flesh. Trees toppled with slow grace, their trunks groaning before snapping in half. Soil fell in ribbons like dry silk unraveling. Beneath it all, the fractured bedrock, once sealed in perfect geologic silence, broke apart in 3 separate faults. One sheared laterally, grinding sideways like tectonic teeth. Another dropped vertically, creating an unseen void nearly 20 meters deep. The third split diagonally, slicing directly beneath the old ridgeline. At the ranger station, Mira jolted awake to the sound of shattering glass. The floor moved beneath her, gentle at first. Then, as if lifting and setting her down again like a heartbeat. She grabbed her jacket, radio, and pack in seconds. No coffee, no delay. She was already out the door by the time the main quake hit. The forest, once lush and teeming, now felt like something in retreat. Trees leaned away from the new opening in the earth, as though fearing its breath. The air was hot. Not surface heat, subterranean heat. The kind that rises from cracks too deep to cool. Mira approached the edge of the collapse with caution. Her boots slipped in loose shale. The hole now resembled a crater. Not clean, not round, but torn. Ugly. Alive. She stood at the lip and looked down. What she saw didn't make sense. Far below, past the broken roots and layers of sediment, there was movement. Not mechanical, not animal. Just a slow shifting of something vast. Mudstone folding inward, like lungs exhaling under pressure. Steam hissed through thin vents. A sound echoed up from the chamber, wet and low, like stone groaning against time. No structure, no artifacts. Just earth, ancient and angry, realigning itself after centuries of silence. Her radio crackled again, but she ignored it. The boar had known. So had the birds. The silence wasn't the absence of life. It was the warning. Everything in the ecosystem had felt the change, had obeyed it, had left. And now, Finally, the earth itself had spoken. Mira stepped back, eyes wide, hands trembling, not in fear, but in awe. Something fundamental had shifted. Not just the land, but the rules that held it still. This was the end of stability, and the beginning of something deeper, something still breathing below.